Good evening. I'm your host, Karen Hudis, in this series on the network of global corporate control. This segment is a sequel to our May 3rd segment when we celebrated the anniversary of this series on the network of global corporate control. We discussed the year of the fire monkey, and we discussed Edmund J.M. Dunn, head of the Royal Illuminati, the world monarch. 2016 is the year of the fire monkey. Feng Shui means wind water. It's a Chinese philosophy about humanity and life. According to Chinese 5 elements horoscopes, 2016 is all about financial events. Another way to understand the year of the fire monkey is like fireworks at the end of the fireworks show, or the phrase, and I apologize in advance for the foul language, but there's no other way to say it, the shit hits the fan. The corruption in the financial system is very deep, and it's so deep that many people would rather not deal with it. That is to be expected. There's a term for this reaction, and it's called the normalcy bias. A year ago, a man named Nick Batista wrote to me about the normalcy bias. He asked me to send him information on how to engage and said, "It's a tough haul, as you know, to get people to open their eyes on what's really happening." So I said, just keep on contacting people and bringing the ones that are receptive on board. Find out what they know and where they can see the disconnects between the reality as they understand it and what they're told. And Nick said, "Thanks, Karen. I've been trying to get people to notice, but the normalcy bias is just too thick for some. They don't even want to know. It's really sad." And I said, yes, what you're calling the normalcy bias is also that people have a hard time acknowledging the depth of the deception. At the same time, the number of people who understand where we are is at critical mass, and we're getting used to dealing with this disconnect. So we will power through. Your response tells me that you're going to help lead us. On Sunday, Future Money Trends released my 5th interview with them on YouTube. There was a lot of commotion in the YouTube comment section until Nick Blaine started serving as a moderator. Sherry McNally said, "Thanks for this guest interview. Information is first acquired, then assimilated. One person's voice certainly does not constitute a choir, but when combined with many other voices, the symphony emerges. So there are now enough voices asking for the world's gold to be returned to them who know the world's gold is in the global debt facility that is administered by the 188 ministers of finance and development, and that these ministers have appointed me to serve as the overseer mandate trustee of the global debt facility. Enough people have learned that paper money issued by private banks like the Federal Reserve Bank for free is not honest money. And when I say for free, they get to keep the difference between what it costs them to print the currency and the face value of the bill. Enough people have learned that the network of global corporate control is a big corrupt force that controls all the central banks. The network of global corporate control is not big enough when enough of us know that this corruption is headquartered in Switzerland. The network of global corporate control owes us $2 quadrillion, and this has put the network of global corporate control into bankruptcy. The network of global corporate control is not in charge. Their puppets are exposed. People have been arguing with me about Donald Trump, and I've been telling them that Trump has no intention of fighting the network of global corporate control, and that he's there to surrender the United States by allowing the Federal Reserve notes to crash without exchanging them for something different that doesn't crash. I have just reconfirmed this sad fact. And there's equal opportunity for puppets. I've disclosed the strings on Hillary Clinton as well. Let me talk about what happened during the presidential debates when Barack Obama was re-elected. I sent an email to CBS News on October 21st, 2012, and I copied a number of people that you can see when I published the teleprompter. This is the heart of the cover-up of world corruption before I knew that the World Bank was really set up as a co-op to administer the world's wealth in the global debt facility. CBS continued the cover-up of corruption, and the presidential debates did not ask Barack Obama or Mitt Romney anything about what they were doing on the corruption. I wrote CBS and the National Taxpayers Union and Germany and U.S. Congress. I told them, roughly 3/4 of the American public consistently prefers that the United States act jointly with other nations in foreign affairs. I told them there are terrible consequences if the United States does not end the cover-up of corruption in the international financial system. I told them that the power transition model from the United States Department of Defense is now predicting an end to the cover-up. And I told them that the American people were being left out of the equation by the malfunctioning of the press. I have more whistleblowing to do in this segment, so we will leave the United States presidential elections for the time being. These disclosures that I'm going to make in this segment are large, so you'll have to bear with me while I set the stage for them. Edmund J.M. Dunn. Let's return to Edmund. He's head of the Royal Illuminati and the World Monarch. I got an email from Edmund Dunn on the 25th of July. He said, "Karen, I'm now too unwell to continue with the litigation. They've nearly killed me and I'm very unwell and have to retire at 42, having lost everything and everyone in my life. We found out who tried to assassinate me to derail the litigation. President Barack Obama. Barclays and Allen & Overy Limited Partnership, that's a law firm, Beyond Evil. The Serious Fraud Office opened a case into the murdered bankers under," and then he's citing a section of the law. "May I wish you well in your ongoing efforts. Regards, Edmund J.M. Dunn." And then he put at the end of his email, on the 22nd of July, 2016, my legal identity ceased to exist and all diplomatic relations with Ireland and Great Britain and the European Union, the United States, and Holy See ended at the Embassy of Ireland in London, having been abandoned by all 4 nation-states who are acting in joint enterprise in criminal obfuscation in both the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. I'm now stateless and an asylum seeker to Israel under the protectorate of Russia, while the United Nations Office and High Commissioner of Human Rights investigate my state-sponsored torture and abuse and attempted assassination. All of this for simply telling the truth and defending myself in courts of law and providing billions of pounds of my own intellectual property for free to protect the diplomatic relationships. A total collapse of the rule of domestic and international law. No room at the inn springs to mind. And that's the end of Edmund's email. You may remember that I told Edmund Dunn that I was going to disclose everything he sent to me, and I then asked Edmund not to write me anymore based on some things that I read about him online. So when he told me that he was so ill, I took the bait and I responded. What I wrote him back was, "Sorry to learn of your travails and your ill health. The Serious Fraud Office is not yet part of the solution. Hang in there. Best, Karen." So then Edmund sent me an email which was a trap. He said that he owned the world's assets as the world's absolute monarch. He tied it up in ribbons by saying that his email was confidential and could not be disclosed. And then he said that any response meant that I was accepting what he had written. I disclosed his email, I disclosed his trap, and I said that on behalf of the world's people and the 188 ministers of finance and development, that humanity's wealth in the global debt facility was intact. You can read my tweet exposing this, which I called "Using Our Empathy to Try and Rob Us." I know this is a big wind-up, but please bear with me because of what I'm going to disclose. This sentence is taken from a retired member of the armed forces, and I'll give you the links to his book called A Grandfather's Disclosure. What he said: "The enemy hides behind authentic Judaism, and when attacked, will deceptively claim anti-Semitism and hate crimes at work. Members of the enemy are not Jews in any way. They don't have a religious or humanitarian bone in their bodies, only a lower order predator instinct." That's the end of his quote. Now, I'm going to be disclosing an email that Aaron Lamertink emailed me about Wall Street, Auschwitz, and the dawning of the atomic age. And the full text is going to be in the links in the teleprompter. I don't think I'm going to have time to get through the full email. He wrote me, "Dear Karen, this may be interesting to you. I've written an article this week about 1. The Bush Nazi money laundering route from New York to Berlin via Rotterdam." And there was an article in The Guardian. Number 2, the IG Farben Buna plant near Auschwitz almost certainly having been a uranium enrichment facility comparable, if not exceeding, the Manhattan Project in its sheer size. 3. The shipment of 560 kilograms of enriched uranium oxide as well as ignition mechanisms for plutonium bombs on the German submarine U-234, which was headed for Japan, but it surrendered to the United States in May 1945. And number 4, the analysis of the Oak Ridge production records by Carter Heydrich, which established that the Manhattan Project could not have produced enough enriched by far to have been able to produce a uranium bomb in August 1945, as well as not having the technology needed to ignite a plutonium bomb. In other words, the atomic bombing of Japan in August 1945 would not have been possible without the enriched uranium produced at Auschwitz, nor the German plutonium bomb ignition devices, both captured from the U-234. You'll also find information regarding the alleged gas chambers there, which must have been some giant propaganda cover-up operation of the atomic secrets of the Germans, in a cooperation between Wall Street and the US and the Russians having liberated the camp and captured the ultra-centrifuges at the plant, which they most likely employed in their own atomic bomb program. We should look at Wall Street and not at the Jews if we want to get an understanding of how the world is being run from behind the scenes. Of course, you're free to republish my article if you wish. Best regards, Aaron Lamertink. And this is now taken from the email that Aaron sent me. For years now, revisionist authors have argued that there's something very wrong with the generally accepted historiography about the complex of factories and concentration camps known as Auschwitz. The debate so far has handled mostly about the question of whether or not it's true that the Germans systematically exterminated large numbers of people in gas chambers. For some reason, the remarkable fact that the supposed Buna plant within the complex produced absolutely nothing, yet consumed more electricity than the entire city of Berlin thus far, almost completely escaped attention. As it turns out, this is just one of the reasons to believe that this plant actually was a uranium enrichment facility. A uranium enrichment facility without which there would have been no A-bombing, neither of Hiroshima nor Nagasaki. There are newly discovered files in the United States National Archives that affirm of which Prescott Bush was a director was involved with the financial architects of Nazism. General Smedley Butler claimed that wealthy businessmen were plotting to create a fascist veterans organization with Butler as its leader and use it in a coup d'etat to overthrow President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1934, Butler testified before the United States House of Representatives Special Committee on Un-American Activities, that was then called the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, on these claims. No one was prosecuted. BBC 4 aired a documentary about this in 2007 and said the coup was aimed at toppling President Franklin D. Roosevelt with the help of 500,000 war veterans. The plotters, who were alleged to involve some of the most famous families in America, they were owners of Heinz, Birdseye, Good Tea, Maxwell, and George Bush's grandfather, Prescott, believed that their country should adopt the policies of Hitler and Mussolini to beat the Great Depression. The extent of the German effort to improve hygienic conditions at Auschwitz is evident from an amazing decision that was made in 1943 and 44. During the war, the Germans developed microwave ovens, not just to sterilize food, but to delouse and disinfect clothing as well. The first operational microwave apparatus was intended for use on the Eastern Front to delouse and disinfect soldiers' clothing. After direct war casualties, infectious diseases were the second greatest cause of casualties of German soldiers. But instead of utilizing these new devices at the Eastern Front, the German government decided to use them in Auschwitz to protect the lives of the inmates, most of whom were Jews. When it came to protecting lives threatened by infectious disease, the Germans obviously gave priority to the Auschwitz prisoners. Since they were working in the Silesian war industries, their lives were apparently considered comparably important to the lives of soldiers on the battlefield. The story so far has been recently summarized as followed by Ian Greenhoff. Without the German uranium and fuses, no atomic bombs would have been completed before 1946 at the earliest. Needless to say, if this were true and was to become widespread knowledge, it would have a significant impact on global politics, which thus would give us a motive for the relentless suppression of revisionists and their theses all over the Western world. While a lot of literature is available on the question of whether or not the Germans systematically exterminated large numbers of people in the gas chambers at Auschwitz, hardly any literature is available on what the actual purpose of the complex was if it was not primarily an extermination camp. The answer to that question not only shines new light on the beginning of the atomic age, it also explains why there is a geopolitical motive to suppress the truth about what happened at Auschwitz. At the end of the line, this suppression goes so far that a professional chemist who wrote a report about the forensic research he conducted at the site ended up behind bars in Germany. So apparently what happened at Auschwitz is important, very important. German Rudolph, the chemist that we mentioned, put it this way: if the Holocaust were unimportant, we wouldn't have around 20 countries on this planet outlawing its critical investigation. In fact, this is the only historical topic that's regulated by criminal law. This is proof of the fact that the powers that be consider this topic to be the most important issue to keep under their strict control. Those censoring, suppressing powers are the real criminals, not the historical dissidents they send to prison. I don't think many people in Europe will disagree that it's important to fight racism and the spreading of hatred. In the Netherlands, where I live, that's Mr. Hammertink, this is regulated by law, which is very reasonable. In practice, such a general formulation of the law has been used successfully to prosecute a number of Holocaust deniers in the Netherlands. See, for example, there's a footnote, and these people were given mild sentences in comparison to other countries. If anything, these sentences make clear that there's absolutely no reason to explicitly make Holocaust denial as such punishable by law while doing so makes it next to impossible to perform independent scientific research on this important historic subject, especially in Germany, where one cannot even defend one's position on the subject with factual data. It's clear that the German law goes way too far, whereby the sentencing of Germar Rudolph is perhaps the most illustrative example of how well-intended laws can go terribly wrong. The story of Germar Rudolph is told in the following documentary, along with the story of Ernst Zundel and Bradley R. Smith, and this was made by David Cole in 2007. Rudolph ended up behind bars after publishing his expert report on chemical and technical aspects of the gas chambers of Auschwitz. So far, it's clear that engaging in this debate from an historic and scientific perspective, even in the Netherlands, is not without risks. Yet, as law-abiding and freedom-loving citizens, we have a moral obligation to speak out against the prosecution of people who are merely doing their job. We cannot allow science and history to be distorted because of geopolitical interests, which is clearly the case here, as we're talking about the history of the atomic weapons of mass destruction, which killed at least 129,000 people in August 1945. Howard Zinn, who was a political science professor at Boston University, said this about our democratic responsibility to say what we want to say, especially when we deal with, quote, deception of the public by the government in times of war, close quote. We have a responsibility to speak out, to speak our minds, especially now, and no matter what they say and how they cry for unity and supporting the president and getting in line. We have a democratic responsibility as citizens to speak out and say what we want to say. One of the other things we need to do is to take a look at history, because history may be useful in helping us understand what's going on. The president isn't giving us history and the media aren't giving us history. They never do. Here we have this incredibly complex, technologically developed media, but you don't get the history that you need to understand what's going on today. There's one kind of history that they will give you, because history can not only be used for good purposes, but history can be abused. History can't give you definitive and positive answers to the issues that come up today, but it can suggest things. It can suggest skepticism about certain things. It can suggest probabilities and possibilities. There are some things you can learn from historical experience. One thing you can learn is that there's a long history of deception of the public by the government in times of war, or just before war, or to get us into war, going back to the Mexican War, when Polk lied to the nation about what was happening on the border between the Oasis River and the Rio Grande. Of all the things I'm going to tell you, remember two words: governments lie. It's a good starting point. I'm not saying governments always lie. No, they don't always lie. But it's a good idea to start off with the assumption that governments lie, and therefore whatever they say, especially when it comes to matters of war and foreign policy. Because when it's a matter of domestic policy, there are things that you may be able to check up on because it's here and in this country. But something happening very far away, people don't know very much about foreign policy. We depend on them because they're supposed to know. They have the experts. With this in mind, let's take a look at David Cole, who made an extraordinary documentary about Auschwitz and addressed all of the issues which should have been openly and honestly debated instead of having been suppressed for geopolitical reasons. Perhaps the most significant part of this documentary is Cole's interview with Dr. Franciszek Piper, a Polish scholar, historian, and author. Most of his work concerns the Holocaust, especially the history of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Cole managed to get Dr. Piper on tape explaining that the alleged gas chamber in Auschwitz, which was said by Cole's tourist guide to be all original, actually is a post-war reconstruction by the Soviets. This part starts at 3550. I'm not going to be showing that clip, but I'll have it in the teleprompter. I'll have links to it. I would suggest to use your own judgment and decide for yourself whether or not this documentary should be regarded as historic review or as Holocaust denial. According to the transcript, these are Dr. Piper's exact words. Quote, "So after the liberation of the camp, the former gas chamber presented a view of an air raid shelter. In order to gain an earlier sight of this object, the inside walls built in 1944 were removed and the openings in the ceiling were made anew. So now this gas chamber is very similar to this one which existed in 1941-42, but not all details were made, so there's no gas-tight doors, for instance, and the additional entrance from the east side remained as it was made in 1944. Such changes were made after the war in order to gain the earlier view of this object. This historic documentary was made over 20 years ago, and today it's just as explosive as when it was when it first came out. Recently, David Cole gave a 2.5-hour-long radio interview about his experiences and his current view on the subject. After this short introduction, I'd like to thank you for listening to another segment of the Network of Global Corporate Control. In this segment, we've learned that much of what we thought we knew about World War II needs to be revisited. We will take our time doing this and not jump to conclusions because we are in the middle of the biggest historical event of our lifetimes, and we know how to work together in the Coalition for the Rule of Law. The biggest historic event, that is the changing of paper currency for gold in what we're calling the global currency reset. Until next week, I'm your host, Karen Hudas.